Hello and welcome everybody on what may well turn out to be a very historic day in the history of the world. We at Sheffield are delighted to welcome Professor William Paris from Wesleyan, whose day will be speaking to us on what may be a timely topic, looking for tomorrow in yesterday, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Utopia of the Souls of Black Folk. Join me all in welcoming Dr. Paris.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me, and thank you specifically for Max for inviting me to talk about this in-progress manuscript that I am working on. And so because it's the first chapter, I thought I'd begin by trying to frame the set of questions that informs what is going on here, and give you kind of a general idea of basically why Utopia and why now. So I am approaching this project because I get the sense that in many ways, Utopia has kind of gotten a bad rap. It is either a sort of an abstract ideal that seems as if it's not connected to social practices and political realities, or because of the legacy of the mid-20th century, there's a turn against it because Utopia was read as totalitarianism and the reduction of all difference to sameness. Well, I want to chart a different theoretical trajectory for Utopia through what I'm calling Black critical theory, but really it's dealing with African-American and Africana political thought. And so I come to this understanding of, what does a social theory mean when it arises from the racialized experience of dislocation, of diaspora, of when utopia is not, simply a fantasy in one's head, but realizing in a sense one lives nowhere and they're trying to flee to get to somewhere where they can actually determine themselves. And I wanted to do this, and in some ways, by calling it Black critical theory, I'm tweaking the idea that critical theory can only be understood as arising from the mid-20th century in Europe, and to say that we can actually reconstruct a tradition of utopia in figures such as W.B. Du Bois, which you read today, but other figures I cover in the book are Marcus Garvey, Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Malcolm X, and say what is harbored in their thought is this idea that there can be a space of political life within this contemporary disaster where Black people can actually discover who they could be, who they are. But in order to do that, they had to challenge the very terms of political life that they'd inherited. Terms such as only thinking political life in terms of the national boundaries of the United States, only thinking of political life as being inducted to a certain dominant culture. And so for me, I wanted to offer a social theory that will understand utopia as actually arising from what I call material contradictions or social crises, rather than abstractly being a sort of thought experiment or something that doesn't arise from practices. And so my claim is that social theory needs a refined utopian epistemology. And by that, I mean a way of investigating the history we have inherited to understand social movements, attempts at freedom that have been frustrated, that have failed, who still carry on in the present. One way of thinking about this, to use a contemporary example from my United States, is thinking about at the George Floyd protests, when the phrase defund the police broke out into the sort of public consciousness. This idea of defunding the police or reorganizing the police has been around for a very, very long time. And so it didn't come from nowhere. But the claim that is being made is that there is a different way we can reconstruct and reorganize our social life. That, the trajectory that we're on is not the trajectory we need to remain on. And so in some sense, that phrase, defund the police, makes no sense to a broad amount of the American population. It seems utopic. It seems idealistic. But in another sense, I want to read it as, what you see me starting to work through, especially near the end of this chapter, as, a social arrangement or social thought that's struggling to break through. And so what I think social theory can do, I don't think it can do everything. I want to be very clear. I am not saying that theory in itself can initiate broad social transformation or revolution, but what it can do is not break faith when these social crises emerge and a new form of life can emerge. To patiently try to investigate them, understand them, try to resituate them and say that this isn't something coming from nowhere, that a new form of social life is possible. So I turned to Du Bois because I want to do two things, and it's working on two levels for me. One, I am committed to the idea that utopia is a big part of what Du Bois is doing. Even though he never says the words utopia, I think you can see from what I cite from him, it's always on his mind of this notion of the true life. The way life ought to be, which is why I think he does have an intimate relationship to Plato's Republic of an understanding that all should be harmonious by being in its proper place, yet looking around and seeing that everything is out of whack, is disharmonious. So yes, I want to show that utopia is in Du Bois's thought because I think this can change how we read Du Bois. Even in his pragmatism, he holds to this idea that there can be a true reorganization of social life such that we can actually find out who we are and who we are meant to be. But the second level I approach Du Bois is I also want to show what I'm trying to do of looking for tomorrow and yesterday by sifting through Du Bois's thinking and finding unfinished aspects of his thought that even he did not follow through. To show that there are elements in Du Bois that can allow us to construct a different vision of the social world, but also a different understanding of who and what Du Boisian thought actually is. So one of the things that and I didn't incorporate into this chapter, but is kind of implied, is that I actually think the stakes of double consciousness are rather different than how they're usually talked about. So, and this in no way disputes the great work that double consciousness has done to try to describe. So I'll go through some of that. All right. None of that is to dispute the great work that double consciousness has done to try to describe what it is to live as a racialized subject in a racist culture. But I think people move too quickly to think that Du Bois is making some claim that all Black people experience double consciousness. Instead, he's actually making a claim that double consciousness is a problem for the talented 10th because they are no longer able to separate the true from the false. And so I want to show that the stakes of Du Bois's argument are, one, that utopia is true, which is a really hard argument to make when you're talking about something that's possible but not yet existing. And two, that actually double consciousness is downstream from the necessity of getting true insight to what ought to be and true insight into what is and how you can make that transition. And so it seems to me that in this chapter, what I'm claiming is that Du Bois sets out the task and souls of Black folk to understand that I mean his contemporary life, political society is false. This is not the way that it should be. And so he wants to show that there must be a way of bringing these different rhythms and harmonies of social life, of the dominant population, the Black population, in synchronicity with one another, such that the whole can flourish. And so the color line for Du Bois, the color line is, it introduces the problem that utopia is meant to solve. It is meant to allow him to present the insight into why the Republic, how race has rendered social life false, uninhabitable, and deleterious, obviously for the Black population, but also for white people as well. He can only come to this insight, though, or he can only try to make this claim if utopia is not to be abstract, is to show that it is possible to see that this life is false from within the very resources he's inherited from this disharmonious republic. If he can show that the true is true actually embedded within the false rather than having to be imported from elsewhere. So he has this wonderful quote after World War I, where he goes, quote, "To more human beings than ever before at one time in the world's history, there came a vision of the glory of sacrifice, a dream of a world greater, sweeter, more beautiful, more honest than ever before, a world without war, without poverty, and without hatred. I am glad it came, even though it was a mirage, it was eternally true. Today, some faint shadow of it comes to me again." So for him to pull off this trick of reconstructing society, he needs to be able to say something along the lines of, even though all of this seems to be such a disaster, even though it seems like a constant ongoing disaster, we can still sift through it and see the way that society ought to be structured. In fact, there are glimmers or glimpses of a new way of social life. And so I begin the chapter by paying attention to Du Bois's early work on social science. I do that in this unpublished essay of his, Sociology Hesitant, in order to claim that he is offering a methodology or a frame of how one can investigate utopia. His the broad part of his argument, Sociology Hesitant, is his claim that he offers the hypothesis that our lives are structured by two rhythms. There's a primary rhythm of what I think he's thinking of as natural laws, like cause and effect, that we can kind of calculate and measure. But when it comes to the human subject, he wants to say that there is a secondary rhythm of chance, where there is an indeterminacy to what we can be and what we can do. He thinks a rigorous social science will try to bring these two rhythms together in order to dispute the idea that the way things are the way that they're always going to be, but also to kind of hold back this idea that anything and everything is possible. So he's looking to develop this balance between, yes, we have to be realist about what is, but also an attention to what could be that we are often missing. In this social science, he is basically setting out this idea that idea that there is this constant split in reality, this constant doubling that he wants to pay attention to, that he thinks needs to be brought together in, as I've been saying, in a harmonious whole. This also allows him to take the problem of race and disinter it from the idea that to be Black is to be caught by the primary rhythm of cause and effect. This is at a time when the racial science at the turn of the century was making predictions about Black people would eventually go extinct, or they had no ability to rule themselves. And so he's trying to work within this seemingly settled, hard primary rhythm of science and say that no, that can't have the last word on who Black people can be, because constitutively Black or people in general are made up as chance. They are made up as a place where laws cannot completely determine their actions. But he doesn't want to just make that case by saying something like you're wrong. He wants to show that we can actually figure this out if you have a different orientation towards truth. This different orientation towards truth is what he develops in an essay called Criteria for Negro Art. In this, he specifies a different truth that ought to guide us besides positive, or what we might call as empirical research, is a truth that, quote, upon whom truth eternally thrusts itself as the highest handmaid of imagination, as the one great vehicle of understanding, end quote. So here, the way that Utopia functions is it's a constant provocation of our imagination to, not simply just accept the world that we've inherited, not simply accept what it seems the hard sciences say about a social group, but it taps into what he thinks can unite us, which is this desire to live in harmony, this desire to have culture, this desire to know. And so he wants to set up, a firm sort of epistemological method to be able to dispute racist science, but also open the way for saying that there's always been a fecund social life in Black people that has not yet had its time. I move on to say that the way Du Bois tries to bring together this primary rhythm and secondary rhythm is with his notion of education and culture. I'm fascinated by this because I think in many ways, again, right now, a lot of people talk about culture, but it's not quite clear what culture means. Culture is often attached to a variety of activities. It seems like it's been stretched so thin that it's just about what a group of people happen to be doing in some sort of synchronicity. But I think Du Bois does have a more refined understanding of culture. And what culture is supposed to do is it elaborates our ability to recognize our social situation and to understand a way forward. And so culture is supposed to incorporate empirical science and the imagination to guide a social group towards flourishing, towards a better way of life. But culture can't come from nowhere. And so what I hope you're hearing in this talk is Du Bois is always trying to bring two threads together. He's trying to find the true within the false. He's trying to find some sort of Black dignity within a racialized culture. He's always trying to find utopia within disaster. So that's actually, again, that's why double consciousness is downstream. It's not the founding issue for him. It's because that there's this prior alienation society that leads to the split within the subject. The reason why I say culture can't come from nowhere for Du Bois is anyone who's read Souls of Black Folk knows how intimately tied it is to Western culture. He does not fantasize about some pure Black culture that has been untainted. In some ways, the reason why I cover Marcus Garvey, you can sometimes get that sense with his Black nationalism of we need to let go of all of these white Western images that have been imposed upon us, go back to Africa, and just develop a new history almost out of nothing. For Du Bois, he wants to say something along the lines of we can bring together what he thinks of as Western culture with what is still unrefined in Black people to produce a new synthesis. The way that I talk about this in the Souls of Black Folk is that what he wants to do is he wants to take the Western archive, the works of Plato, the works of Aristotle, and reveal that even though they've been used to say that Black people they don't have culture, they don't have history, that there's still something true within that tradition used to guide Black people out of this social morass. He does this with the way that he approaches his own life. Through his training in the arts and sciences, he's able to craft this narrative of himself as almost transitioning from the dark, from ignorance into knowledge and understanding. I use the Greek term ananoresis here, where he gains insight into the true nature of things. He offers his life as an example of what Black people and Black culture could be. He tries to offer his life when he says, that famous line about, they look at me with the unasked question of what does it mean to be a problem? And the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He offers himself as already seeing that a new way of life is possible. And you're supposed to take what he is doing, and he is saying, by reading Shakespeare, reading Balzac, reading Dumas, I now am no longer understanding myself as wretched, but I'm also not simply trying to assimilate or incorporate, but I am taking what is true in that and appropriating that to develop a new way of social life for Black people that they can take into a new place. What I think is important here for what I am thinking about is also it pushes back against the idea, and I am, committed to this. The idea that one can immediately know um, one's oppression, one can immediately know that things are wrong. It seems as if Du Bois is saying that it takes a certain type of work that only culture can provide, of refining people so that they can actually understand that the life that they are living is false and move them towards the true. That's the first half of the chapter, but of trying to understand how Du Bois is trying to rescue the true from the false. But I think that there's a problem here, though, in Du Bois that I am deeply critical of. His most infamous concept is the talented tenth. And this is where I think, again, the sort of legacy of Plato's Republic haunts Du Bois's thought. Because he has to answer the question of how does this culture of refinement for Black people come about? And he's going to say, and he is rather clear on this, quote, "The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men." Further on, he goes, "The problem of education then among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race that they may guide the mass away from contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races." A problem with this idea of of trying to find the truth in the false, and the notion that only a select people can do it, is this issue of elitism, where Du Bois realizes that, unfortunately, if we don't have immediate access to the way our lives are lived falsely, we have to depend on a sort of aristocracy to show us the way. And many people have said that Du Bois comes to this idea not just because of his philosophical training, but because of the way that society was becoming organized at this point in time after Reconstruction, where there was this dream that social science could figure out all the problems in society and make it as harmonious as possible. This top-down theory of change is not the one I want to argue for Utopia. That would run to the issue of how is Utopia not in some sense totalitarian? Who gets to decide what the Utopia is? This is where I start to notice, I think, some ambivalence in Du Bois's thought, though. Because if he is trying to do this hard work of understanding how a new society can be developed from within the old, he cannot assume that the talented tenth are somehow immune from the very society that they've been crafted in. He hopes that their studies will protect them. Their studies will give them the type of character and insight so that they can't be led astray. But he looks at the talented tenth, or the people he hopes will be the advance guard, and what he sees are people who are not committed to the uplift of Black people generally. In fact, they themselves become swept up in the lie that this is about their own wealth accumulation. They actually become the type of people who are disenchanted with and condescending towards the mass of Black people who haven't had their education. And so he is wondering, how can the talented tenth themselves be saved so that they can be the way that I think of it as, the philosopher kings and queens? What is the wisdom? Where can the wisdom come from to allow them to stay faithful to the true society that needs to come? Just want to check my time. Am I good in time? Okay.
You're doing great. You're fine.
Okay. All right. So why is this an important question? This is an important question because if I don't want Utopia to simply be fantasy, but I also want to make a sort of concrete, realist account of it, I need to show how Utopia can still emerge even when we are talking about fallible, finite creatures who are working in these social movements. And what Du Bois sees in Souls of Black Folk, even when he makes the explicit argument for the talented tenth, he realizes they are not enough if they are not actually grounded in the real existing rhythms of the Black community themselves. He has this really tragic story called Of the Coming of John in Souls of Black Folk, where John, I take it, is this representative of the talented tenth who leaves his Black community in the South, goes north. Literally, it sounds like, again, the allegory of the cave. He goes up and he gets his education, and he actually, Du Bois in the story, he answers the question of why the philosopher or the person goes back down, which is, even though he gets his education, he still encounters racial antagonism, racial discrimination. And so he realizes all this education, it's not enough. So it's not enough to simply figure out the true ideals in the Western culture that you have absorbed. You need something more. And what you need more is the actual living Black people who are supposed to be free, who are supposed to be saved. So he goes back down south. And again, it seems like it's this image of when the philosopher goes back into the cave, and what happens? The prisoners fight the philosopher and all of that. And so when he goes back down, he realizes, quote, little had they understood of what he said, for he spoke an unknown tongue. What is also implicit there is that John comes back and he's condescending. He doesn't know who these people are anymore. He doesn't know what they want. He doesn't know their practices. He thinks that because I've learned this knowledge up high, you all have nothing to contribute. And so they reject him. The story ends tragically in an act of violence where John is given this, he is shown to be this tragic character, the talented tenth, who's completely unmoored from either the social base of the Black people he wants to serve, but also he can't live in this racialized society that tries to inferiorize him. So he ends up killing another character who's attacking his sister, and the story ends with him whistling the Wagner song from Lohengrin as a lynch mob descends upon him. Now, if that were the end of the story, it would seem that this is a bleak book where, it would almost seem dystopic, where you find this space of possibility in knowledge, but it turns out the reality of racialized violence can still overwhelm you. I think Du Bois's point is rather different. Du Bois is trying to dramatize or give the reader the insight that if you think that this utopic leadership can work by simply being top down, you're going to find yourself abandoned, and you're going to need what Black people themselves can contribute. And so he ends with this music from Western culture. And the last chapter famously is called Of the Sorrow Songs. The Sorrow Songs, which you all may or may not know, are also known as Negro spirituals. They are songs that often still carry resonances of West African rhythms. They were the songs that slaves would sing on the plantations while they were working, and they kept being passed down again and again and again. Du Bois describes this experience of listening to the sorrow songs, and he realizes, quote, a haunting echo in which the soul of the Black slave spoke to men. The sorrow songs offer actually a material experience of another way of life that Du Bois realizes he needs to learn from. What's fascinating in this moment, where he seems to reverse the allegory of the cave, where he talks about the music, quote, was welling up to me from the caverns of brick and mortar. It fills him with hope. And then, quote again, somewhere in this whirl and chaos of things, there dwells eternal good. And in his good time, America shall rend the veil and the prisoned shall go free. What Du Bois tries to do here is he wants to bring together the ideals that the talented tenth have gotten from, generally called Western culture, with the ongoing social practices of these Black people who have developed their own music to express not just their mourning, but their hope. He thinks that this music, its message, has been frustrated by being overlaid with, Du Bois's relationship to Christian theology is always complicated, but he thinks it's been frustrated by being overlaid with this Christian theology, that there is something truer and purer in it. And in that, I bring this chapter together to say that Du Bois wants to align these two rhythms of Western culture and the Negro spirituals, such that what allows the talented tenth to lead is that they are actually taking their guidance from the ongoing inheritances of the practices of Black people there. But why should the music be able to do this? I don't actually think it's a metaphysical argument, even though Du Bois does use this kind of Platonic language of eternal good. It is actually the fact that in order for these people to learn these songs, they must already be organizing their lives, gathering in places, teaching one another, expressing what they want and what they need. And what the talented tenth loses is that they become alienated from those practices, and they need to find a way of re-entering it to show the broader American public that there can be a harmony even within what is unfairly a debased way of living. And so we return to this idea of two rhythms, and that Du Bois is trying to align together and show that actually utopia is constantly pressing forward in these practices that we often don't recognize or we don't give enough attention to. And for me, I end that chapter there, and I'll move on to talking about Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, where he starts to make the argument that no, Black people are always ready to self-govern, but we need an appropriate understanding of history that can get rid of the propaganda that buries them and makes them seem as if they are simply a disharmonious element of the Republic that needs to either be constrained or expelled. And I will end there.
Thank you very much, William. It's our norm to take a sort of 3 to 5 minute break. So I think probably everyone will want to go and check their phones and read the latest news. So let's make it a 5 minute break. So let's reconvene at 3:12. And at that point, we can commence the Q&A. And I'm going to stop the recording here.